Good evening, fabulous people. I think it is time we talk about the FBI. According to Wikipedia, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is the primary federal law enforcement agency in the United States and also the American Domestic Intelligence and Security Service. An agency of the United States Department of Justice, the FBI is a member of the U.S. intelligence community and reports to both the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence, that would be Pam Bondi and Tulsi Gabbard, respectively. A leading American counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and criminal investigative organization, the FBI has jurisdiction over violations of more than 200 categories of federal crimes. The FBI maintains a list of its top 10 most wanted fugitives. And here we go. The agency executives are currently Kash Patel, Director, Dan Bongino and Andrew Bailey, Deputy Directors, J. William Rivers, Associate Deputy Director, and Corey F. Ellis, Chief of Staff. Its divisions include Intelligence Branch, Counterterrorism Division, Cyber Division, Counterintelligence, National Investigative Division, International Operations, Social Media Department, and Advertising Department. Although many of the FBI's functions are unique, its activities in support of national security are comparable to M15 and the Russian FSB. Unlike the CIA, which has no law enforcement authority and is focused on intelligence collection abroad, the FBI is primarily a domestic agency, maintaining 56 field offices in major cities throughout the United States and more than 400 resident agencies in smaller cities and areas across the nation. At an FBI field office, a senior-level FBI officer concurrently serves as a representative of the Director of National Intelligence. The mission of the FBI is to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution of the United States of America. Its priorities. Its top priorities are protect the United States from terrorist attacks, protect the United States against foreign intelligence operations, espionage, and cyber operations, combat significant cyber criminal activity, combat public corruption at all levels, protect civil rights, combat transnational criminal enterprises, combat major white-collar crimes, and significant violent crime. Its budget in 2019 was $9.6 billion. I think this needs to be updated. Can't even imagine what it is after the big, beautiful bill. President Roosevelt instructed Attorney General Charles Bonaparte to organize an autonomous investigative service that would report only to the Attorney General. Bonaparte contacted other agencies, including the U.S. Secret Service, for personnel, investigators in particular. On May 27, 1908, Congress forbade this use of Treasury employees by the Justice Department, citing fears that the new agency would serve as a secret police department. Again, at Roosevelt's urging, Bonaparte moved to organize a formal Bureau of Investigation, which would then have its own staff of special agents. The Bureau of Investigation was created on July 26, 1908. Attorney General Bonaparte, using Department of Justice expense funds, hired 34 people, including some veterans of the Secret Service, to work for a new investigative agency. Its first chief, the title is now director, was Stanley Finch. Bonaparte notified Congress of these actions in December of 1908. The Bureau's first official task was visiting and making surveys of the houses of prostitution in preparation for enforcing the Mann Act, passed on June 25, 1910. In 1932, the Bureau was named the United States Bureau of Investigation. The following year, 1933, the BOI was linked to the Bureau of Prohibition and rechristened the Division of Investigation. It became an independent service within the Justice Department in 1935. In the same year, its name was officially changed to from the Division of Investigation to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And that leads us to Hoover, first director of the FBI. Now, if you don't know what the Mann Act was, that was an act to further regulate interstate and foreign commerce by prohibiting the transportation therein for immoral purposes of women and girls and for other purposes. I don't know about all that. I mean, who knows, right? I know our presidents and our government has been involved in human and drug smuggling and weapon smuggling for so long. So who knows if it even started off. Let's just keep going. The following year, 1933, the BOA was linked to the Bureau of Prohibition and rechristened the division. Back to J. Edgar Hoover. My apologies. J. Edgar Hoover served as FBI director from 1924 to 1972, a combined 48 years with the BOI, DOI, and FBI. He was chiefly responsible for creating the Scientific Crime Detection Lab, or the FBI laboratory, which officially opened in 1932 as part of his work to professionalize investigations by the government. He was substantially involved in most major cases and projects that the FBI handled during his tenure. Now, what I'm not seeing here is that since its inception in the FBI, Hoover was ensnared in a blackmail trap by the Jewish mafia, specifically Meyer Lansky, because Hoover was a closeted homosexual. And Lansky acquired photographs of him with, I believe it was his longtime aide. Early homicide investigations of the new agency include the Osage Indian murders. During the War on Crime in the 1930s, FBI agents apprehended or killed a number of notorious criminals who committed kidnappings, bank robberies, and murders throughout the nation, including John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Kate Ma Barker, Alvin Creepy Karpis, and George Machine Gun Kelly. In 1993, an article by LA Times talks about his homosexual tryst. In a new book, it contends that former FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover was a homosexual who was blackmailed by the mafia into denying the existence of organized crime for decades. So it was Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello obtained photos of Hoover's alleged homosexual activity with longtime aide Clyde Tolson and used them to ensnare the FBI so that they would not be targeted for any of their illegal activities. And because of this one man, well, I mean, come on, we all know about the mafia in the United States, right? But even in the 40s, because of Hoover's corruption, the Jewish mafia was able to smuggle weapons from the United States to Israel, first through ports that they pretty much ran, and then later out of Panama. God only knows what else they were able to do because of Hoover's corruption and the FBI's corruption. As head of the FBI, Hoover made a habit of squirreling away information about the sexual lives of Washington's power elite, including John and Robert Kennedy, Eleanor Roosevelt, and others, according to a number of biographers. There's a book published by G.P. Putnam's Sons. The book quotes two former OSS officials who say they saw pictures of Hoover engaged in a sexual act with Tolson. Summers writes that electronics expert Gordon Novel said that CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton, now deceased, showed him several photos, including one of Hoover engaged in sexual activity with Tolson. He offers the theory that OSS Chief William Donovan and Hoover, while feuding over control of foreign intelligence, investigated each other, and Donovan came up with the photos. The Summers book quotes Susan Rosenthal, the fourth wife of mobster and liquor distributor Louis Solon Rosenthal, as saying she saw Hoover dressed up in women's clothes and involved in homosexual play at sex parties at the Plaza Hotel in New York City in the 1950s. And it's interesting, too, because Trump declared bankruptcy of the Plaza, I believe, in 1997, and right after that, the Russian mob bosses moved in. So the Plaza, if only the Plaza could speak, it's like a criminal playground. It's interesting. The FBI has maintained files on numerous people, including celebrities such as Elvis Presley, Frank Sinatra, John Denver, John Lennon, Jane Fonda, Groucho Marx, Charlie Chaplin, the band MC5, Lou Costello, Sonny Bono, Bob Dylan, Michael Jackson, and Mickey Mantle. The reason for the existence of the files varied. Some of the subjects were investigated for alleged ties to the Communist Party, like Chaplin and Marx, or in connection with anti-war activities, like John Denver, John Lennon, and Jane Fonda. Numerous celebrity files concerned threats or extortion attempts against them. Sonny Bono, John Denver, John Lennon, Elvis Presley, Michael Jackson, Mickey Mantle, Groucho Marx, and Frank Sinatra. The FBI, 1985 wiretapping and civil liberties report by the U.S. Congress, found that they had installed over 7,000 national security surveillances, including many on American citizens, from 1940 to 1960. Involved in covert operations on political groups as well. The COINTELPRO, derived from Counterintelligence Program, was a series of covert and illegal projects conducted between 1956 and 1971 by the United States FBI, aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting American political organizations that the FBI perceived as subversive. In one particularly controversial 1965 incident, white civil rights worker Viola Liuzzo was murdered by KKK, who gave chase and fired shots into her car after noticing that her passenger was a young African-American man. One of the Klansmen was Gary Thomas Rowe, an acknowledged FBI informant. The FBI spread rumors that Liuzzo was a member of the Communist Party and a heroin addict, and had abandoned her children to have sexual relationships with African Americans involved in the civil rights movement. So an FBI informant who was in the KKK murdered Americans, and instead of being held accountable, the FBI covered up for him, and completely slandered this woman. She was murdered, and the FBI ruined her reputation. FBI records show that J. Edgar Hoover personally communicated these insinuations to President Johnson. And here is a picture of the lovely Viola. May she rest in peace. And you will see that the FBI has a long history of killing American citizens and covering it up. Now, they in fact didn't kill her themselves, but their informant did, and they covered up for him. And that was in Selma, Alabama. A lot of people don't understand. America isn't the racist nation that our government and our public school system has convinced so many. It's a real shame, but a lot of people don't know our history. And take, for example, lynchings. A third of all lynchings in America were of Caucasians. But the intent is to divide us. I want to just kind of give you a real quick history of some of the scandals that the FBI has been involved in before I go any further, before I get to the 90s. So if you're not familiar with what the FBI was doing in the 90s, it's going to blow your mind. So the FBI in the 90s, I mean, that's when I started to become aware of their corruption. Bill Barr was the Attorney General from, I believe it was 1991 to 1993. And when Trump appointed him during his first presidency, that raised tremendous red flags because of his history with the FBI. During the 50s, the FBI engaged in widespread surveillance of the gay world. Not only did it collect from local vice squads the names of men arrested on homosexual moral charges, it also placed a watch on gay bars and infiltrated the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis. Now here on the FBI.gov website, there's an article titled "And Justice for All, 1954 through 1971." And it goes into the history of, when 9 black-robed Supreme Court judges sat down behind the mahogany bench on spring day in 1954 and declared that a separate school system of schools for Africans and Caucasians was not really equal after all, turning Jim Crow on its ear, the winds of change began to blow across America. They'd blow harder still when a 42-year-old African woman named Rosa Parks, after a long day at work, refused to give up her bus seat to a Caucasian man on the first day of December 1955. And when a young, then unknown, Baptist preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. took up her cause and led a successful bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. "We shall overcome." Africans and Caucasians alike soon began singing. And what they hoped to overcome was the deep-seated prejudice and injustice that existed in this country for far too long. Thomas Jefferson had penned the classic phrase, "All men are created equal," nearly 2 centuries earlier, calling for a self-evident truth. But the question was, did we as a nation really mean it? Could we deliver justice for all? And what people need to understand is our government, it's never been about our hue. It's always been us versus them. They just divide us so that they control us and manipulate us. During this time, the FBI was playing a key role through its criminal and national security cases. It took the lead in investigating the high-profile assassinations of national leaders like President Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Senator Robert Kennedy. It also investigated the Kent State shootings and other related incidents and attacks. And we all know how they covered up both Kennedy brothers and Martin Luther King's assassination. We still don't know the truth about any of those assassinations. The FBI addressed domestic terrorism threats from militant left-wing groups, as it had from communists in the 50s and the KKK in the 60s, using traditional investigative and intelligence techniques. One such operation was COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, approved by the National Security Council in 1956. COINTELPRO initially focused on disrupting the activities of the Communist Party of the United States. And here is a photograph of the disgraced FBI Director Hoover, along with President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, a senator, who would have been president. So frustrating. Okay, let's just run down some more scandals. In January of 1964, the FBI spied on the Barry Goldwater campaign at President Johnson's direction. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In June of 1964, the FBI threatened Martin Luther King Jr., telling him to kill himself. In December of 1969, the FBI, as part of its COINTELPRO program and using a paid informant, was involved in the 1969 raid that killed young Black Panther leader Fred Hampton. In March 8th of 1971, the FBI never managed to solve a burglary into their own offices. And in February of 1976, the FBI violates international treaty law by threatening a developmentally disabled woman into signing 3 false affidavits. And that leads us to August 22nd, 1992, Ruby Ridge. And this is where Bill Barr comes in as well. Now, I'm not going to go any further. I'm going to stop at Ruby Ridge, and then we'll go on to Waco in the next video, because there's so much information to go over in Ruby Ridge, and I don't want to make this video too long. So let me pull up some information about Ruby Ridge for you. Every American needs to know about this stuff. course, they don't teach this in public school. So this is from an article, The American Conservative. And it goes about Bill Barr being appointed by the Trump administration and how nobody asked him anything about Ruby Ridge. Because it was a cover-up, just like everything else. Okay, so this story is about the Weaver family, Randy and Vicki and their children. I got this article from ammo.com. Siege at Ruby Ridge, the forgotten history of the ATF shootout that started a militia movement. The short version is this. Randy Weaver and his wife Vicki moved from with their 4 kids to the Idaho Panhandle near the Canadian border to escape what they thought was an increasingly corrupt world. They were not involved in any violent activity or rhetoric, but held separatist beliefs. They were peaceful Christians who simply wanted to be left alone. Specifically for his beliefs, Randy Weaver was targeted by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms in an entrapping sting operation designed to gain his cooperation as a snitch. When he refused to help the ATF, and he refused to become a federal informant, he was charged with illegally selling firearms. So that's how the ATF works. Due to a miscommunication about his court date, the Marshal Service was brought in, who laid siege to his house. Randy Weaver was, in many ways, a typical American story. He grew up in an Iowa farming community. He got decent grades in high school and played football. His family attended church regularly. He dropped out of community college and joined the United States Army, where he served for 3 years, starting in 1970. He was honorably discharged. A month later, he married Victoria Jordanson. He then enrolled at the University of Northern Iowa, studying criminal justice with an eye toward becoming an FBI agent. However, he dropped out because the tuition was too expensive. He ended up working in a John Deere plant while his wife worked as a secretary before becoming a homemaker. They sought a life away from mainstream America, a life of self-reliance. Vicki, in particular, had strong visions of her family, surviving far away from what they viewed as a corrupt world. To that end, Randy purchased a 20-acre farm in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, and bought a cabin there. The land was purchased for $5,000 in cash and the trade of the truck they used to move there. And Vicki homeschooled her children. After moving to Ruby Ridge, Weaver became acquainted with members of the Aryan nations in nearby Hayden Lake. He even attended some rallies. The FBI believed his involvement in the church was much deeper than it actually was. They thought he was a regular congregant of the Aryan nations and had attended the Aryan Nations World Congress. Both Randy and Vicki were interviewed by the FBI in 1985, with Randy denying membership in the group, citing profound theological differences. Indeed, the Weavers, who had some points of agreement with the Aryan nations, primarily about the importance of the Old Testament, mostly saw their affiliation with the Aryan nations as a social outlet. Living off-grid, the nearby members were neighbors in remote northern Idaho. So the FBI thought that they were members, but the reality of the situation is that they were just neighbors. They were friendly with them. They were their neighbors. Later in 1986, Randy was approached at a rally to undercover ATF informant Kenneth Fatterly, who used a biker alter ego of Gus Magasono and was currently monitoring and investigating Weaver's friend Frank Kumnick. Fadderly introduced himself as an illegal firearms dealer from New Jersey. Randy later encountered Fadderly at the World Congress in 1987. He skipped the next year's Congress to run for county sheriff, an election that he lost. The ATF claims that in 1989, Fadderly purchased 2 illegally shortened shotguns from Randy Weaver. However, Weaver disputes this, saying that the shotguns he sold Fadderly were entirely legal and were shortened after the fact. The notes from the case show that Fadderly purchased the guns and showed Weaver where to shorten them, which would constitute illegal entrapment. What's more, the government preyed on the destitute nature of the Weavers, who lived in a small cabin in the woods with no electricity or running water. The real purpose of the investigation was not to grab Weaver, but to use him to infiltrate a group in Montana being organized by Charles Howarth. In November 1989, Weaver refused to introduce Fadderly to Howarth, and Fadderly, was ordered by his handlers to have no further contact with Weaver. Randy Weaver refuses to turn snitch. In 1990, Fadderly's cover was blown. It was then that the ATF reached out to Weaver, stating that they had evidence he was dealing illegal firearms. They told him they would drop all charges if he would agree to become their new informant regarding the investigation of the Aryan Nations group in the area. Weaver refused. To coerce him into changing his mind, the feds staged a stunt where a broken-down couple were at the side of the road. Weaver stopped to help them and was handcuffed, thrown face down in the snow, and arrested. He had to post his home as bond. Still, he refused to become a federal informant. The irony of the federal government's desire to obtain informants within the Aryan Nations is that different branches of federal law enforcement and intelligence gathering occupied 5 of the 6 key positions in the organizations. This means that the Aryan Nations were effectively a government-run shop, with agents spying on each other to ensure the integrity of an investigation into an organization almost entirely run by the federal government. The government had an obsession with the Aryan Nations due to Robert J. Matthews, who was a member of the Order, a terrorist organization including members of the Aryan Nations. The FBI's hostage rescue team burned Matthews alive inside his own home. Due to his ongoing refusal to snitch, Weaver was then arrested in January 1991 on illegal firearms sales charges. These charges stem from Weaver's earlier sale of 2 shortened shotguns to Fadderly, the undercover ATF agent, a sale which the feds later admitted constituted illegal entrapment. Weaver's court date was set for February 19, 1991, then changed to the next day. Weaver, however, received notice that his court date was not until March 20th. He missed the February court appearance, and a bench warrant was issued for his arrest. The United States Marshal's Service wanted to allow Weaver the chance to appear for what he thought was his court date. However, the United States Attorney's Office sought a grand jury indictment on March 14th, 6 days before his notice said he was due in court. Already skeptical of the feds after their repeated strong-arm tactics, both Randy and Vicky saw this as further evidence that Weaver would not receive a fair trial. They increasingly isolated themselves on the Ruby Ridge farm, vowing to fight rather surrender peacefully. So, this led to a standoff. A voluntary surrender date was negotiated within the Marshal Service for October 1991, but the United States Attorney's Office refused the settlement. The Deputy Director of the Special Operations Group of the Marshal Service, using evidence obtained through surveillance, believed that the best course of action was to drop the indictment, issue a new one under seal, and use undercover agents to arrest Weaver, who presumably would have dropped his guard. This recommendation was again rejected. On August 21, 1992, 6 heavily armed, camouflaged U.S. Marshals went to the Weaver property with the purpose of reconnaissance. The Weaver's dog gave away the position of the Marshals, alerting their 14-year-old son, Sammy. and a 24-year-old friend of the family named Kevin Harris, who investigated what the dogs were barking at while armed. Unsurprisingly, there are several accounts of how the shooting began. But we know now that the marshals fired first and refused to identify themselves. The marshals claimed that when they rose to identify themselves, they were fired on by the child and the family friend. In yet another version of events, marshals shot the Weavers' dog Stryker as he exposed their position and were fired upon by Sammy in retaliation. So the marshals had two different stories. Unfortunately, once the shooting began, Randy Weaver's son Sammy was shot in the back by marshals immediately after yelling, "I'm coming, Dad," as he ran back to the house. That is to say, he was fleeing the scene, not regrouping for another attack. After this initial exchange, the FBI's hostage rescue team, sometimes despairingly called the hostage roasting team due to their proclivity to burn down buildings, was called in to assess the situation. Sniper and his observer teams were deployed by the hostage rescue team. A sniper aimed for an instant kill shot on Randy, but Randy moved at the last minute and the shot entered his shoulder, exiting through his armpit. He then fled back to the house from the shed where he had been viewing the body of his now dead son. A second shot missed Kevin Harris and hit Vicky in the head while she was holding their 10-month-old daughter in her arms. This same second shot hit Harris after exiting Vicky. An internal investigation found that the second shot was out of policy and that the failure to request surrender when it was inexcusable. FBI sniper Lon Hiriochi fired through a door without seeing who was on the other side of it, at people who were fleeing and posed no threat. He was later charged with manslaughter in these deaths, but the charges were dropped. Hiriochi was also involved in the Waco siege, and Timothy McVeigh printed up cards for gun shows encouraging people to target him. Indeed, McVeigh considered targeting Hiriochi and his family rather than the federal building. In 1995, he pleaded the Fifth when questioned about the matter by the United States Senate. His whereabouts are currently unknown. The rules of engagement were changed on the fly to effectively encourage shooting anyone on site. This included the remaining Weaver children, who were known to carry weapons 81% of the time. Once the siege began, none of the Weavers fired a shot. The standoff lasted 10 days and involved between 350 and 400 agents who cruelly named their camp Camp Vicky. They would routinely call out Vicky, "We have blueberry pancakes," but claimed to not know that she was dead. Supporters of the Weavers and opponents of the ATF and FBI formed a vigil. Weaver's commanding officer from Vietnam, James Bo Gritz, who was currently running for president on the Populist Party ticket, acted as a mediator between the family and government agents. Radio broadcaster Paul Harvey intervened, offering to pay for a robust defense for Weaver if he surrendered. This was what led Weaver to abandon the standoff and surrender himself to federal authorities. Weaver was charged with 10 counts, including the original charges of illegal firearm sales. His attorney, Jerry Spence, successfully defended Weaver against a host of charges, including murder, by using a self-defense argument. Weaver was ultimately only convicted of the charge of failure to appear, for which he was sentenced to 18 months in prison and a fine of $10,000. He was credited with time served plus 3 months. Kevin Harris was acquitted for all charges. These were the longest deliberations in Idaho criminal history. Weaver sued the federal government, which avoided a civil trial by awarding damages of $1 million each to the 3 surviving Weaver children and $100,000 to Randy. Harris eventually received a settlement of $380,000 after several years of appeals against a government who claimed they would never issue any payment to someone who had killed a federal marshal. In 1996, Weaver offered his services to diffuse tensions between the FBI and the Montana Freemen. However, this offer was declined. In 2000, Weaver visited the former site of the Branch Davidian Church that had been destroyed in another high-profile siege in Waco, Texas. He later offered support to Edward and Elaine Brown, who were resisting federal taxes at the time. Randy and his daughter Sarah wrote a book about the events in 1998 entitled The Federal Siege at Ruby Ridge. The family now live in Kalispell, Montana. Sarah became a born-again Christian in 2012 and forgave the federal agents. Now, Idaho versus Hirochi, the case against the FBI sniper. Attorney General from 1991 to 1993, William Barr was responsible for both the U.S. Marshal Service and the FBI during the siege at Ruby Ridge, but it wasn't until after leaving office that Barr did the most damage. In 1997, brave Idaho prosecutor Denise Woodbury charged Lon Hirochi, the FBI sniper who fatally shot Vicki Weaver, with involuntary manslaughter. The case was dismissed, but was eventually reversed by the Ninth Circuit, which held that the case could stand trial. By now, enough time had gone by that Woodbury got defeated in the 2000 election, and prosecutor Brett Benson was now on the case. It was during this time that Barr worked pro bono, behind the scenes, to seek immunity for Hirochi. He organized former attorney generals and others to help defend Hirochi, and he helped frame legal documents in their appeal to the Ninth Circuit. Barr's attempt was a success, and prosecutor Benson dismissed all charges against Hirochi. Benson later resigned due to charges of forgery and falsifying documents. Hirochi's case was dismissed on September 14, 2001. Special prosecutor Stephen Yagman, who had been appointed by Woodbury to handle the case and was later fired by Benson, said of the final outcome, "I could not disagree more with this decision than I do." Hirochi went on to be promoted in the FBI. He never spent a day in jail, and he never missed a day's pay. William Barr went on to hold several posts within the Department of Justice and the CIA, and eventually became the Attorney General under President Donald Trump. So, that brings us to 1993 in Waco. I'm going to save that for my next video. It's just a lot to think about. But most importantly, I just want everybody to know just how disgustingly sick and evil our FBI is and has always been, and not to believe anything that they say. They've been liars from the start. Thank you so much for staying with me this whole time. I know this video is a little bit longer, but it's really important that we all know our history, especially in regards to the FBI and what's going on today with Charlie Kirk. We do know that they're lying to us, but eventually the truth will come out, and we just pray that those involved are held accountable and that no more lives are taken. And with that, I say have a wonderful night. God bless you. I love you. And I'll see you next time. Bye.